Welcome, everyone. I think we've just got a few more people joining us from the waiting room. I'm going to make sure we've got everybody here. We're just after 7. All right, so welcome, everyone. My name is Lara Villamat. I am the head of Outreach and Community Experience here at the Framingham Public Library. We are so thrilled that you are here to join us tonight for tonight's event. It's From Outcasts to First Families, the Salem Witch Tragedy and the Founding of Framingham. We've got with us Dr. Anita Danker, and she will take us through the history of the families and the founding of Framingham. A few quick notes before we get started. At the end of the lecture, we will have some time for question and answer period. You could enter your questions into the chat, and I will read them out loud to Anita during the question and answer section. Make sure that when you send your questions in, that you choose send to everyone, just in case someone has the same question. As you heard the lady tell you as you came in, tonight's event is being recorded. So if you know anyone who was not able to be here tonight, please send them to our YouTube channel where tonight's video will be uploaded. It usually takes us about 5 to 7 days to get that up on the YouTube channel. I'll be adding an evaluation form into our chat. We'd love to hear from you, what you thought about tonight's program, if you have any ideas for future programs, and of course, if you'd like to join our mailing list to find out about the programs that we've got going. I'll put that in at the beginning and at the end. Please make sure you wait until the very end of the presentation because it will send you to a brand new page. And last but not least, I'd like to turn it over to Anita.
Thank you very much, Lara, and good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and very excited to share all of this work that I've been doing on my own neighborhood and a very interesting neighborhood in our community. So here we go. Well, here it is. It's the last week of October, and Halloween is almost upon us. Salem, Massachusetts, the Witch City, as it's called, is a hotbed of activity. Just this morning, I heard a radio host refer to Salem as a fun city. Visitors from near and far go there to celebrate. The atmosphere is festive and carnival-like. So it's easy to forget that Salem's notoriety stems from a terrible tragedy during which 20 inhabitants of Salem Village and surrounding towns were executed after having been accused of practicing witchcraft. In all, 160 to 200 individuals were accused, depending on which sources you consult, and most of the accused were women. One of them, Sarah Clays, survived and moved with her husband, Peter, and a small group of family members to a largely undeveloped parcel of land that formed a significant chunk of what is now the city of Framingham. I'm here to tell you the story of how this tainted band of emigres started over and helped build a new community in the process. Perhaps you've heard the legend of the witch caves in the Ashland Town Forest. In the winter of 1693, this event supposedly occurred, but actually it didn't. The story, which has largely been discounted by historians, is that Sarah Clays and family members fled the Salem area after her release or escape from the Ipswich jail, where she had spent several months after having been accused of the crime of witchcraft. And that she and some of her family members spent their first winter hiding out in the woods with caves and hollowed out tree trunks to serve as shelter. The now collapsed caves in question are located to the south of the water tower in blue that you see to the right and the right-hand side of the map above the yellow trail. These pictures, by the way, of the collapsed caves were taken by my daughter this past Saturday. Now, closer to the truth about what really happened is that These early residents of what we now know as Framingham never spent any time in those caves, at least not during that first winter. The witchcraft hysteria had died down in the fall of 1692, and Sarah was released from jail, and Governor Phipps issued a general pardon in the early spring of 1693, and the Clays family probably just hid out with friends in the Salem Village area or in one of the surrounding towns until the springtime, when they relocated to a remote piece of land owned by Thomas Danforth, near an old Native American site on the Cowassock Brook. More about the role of Thomas Danforth later. Let's take a few minutes now to consider the backstory and set a context for what happened here. The Salem witch trials took place in Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. As I mentioned earlier, between 160 and 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, the devil's magic. 19 were found guilty and were hanged. 1 was tortured to death, and 5 died in jail awaiting their hearings. Those jails were pretty grim places. By the way, those who were accused, whether they were deemed innocent later or not, had to pay rent for being housed in those jails for however long they were there. Now, at this time in history, many Christians, as well as those practicing other religions, believed that the devil was actively pursuing his diabolical work by giving certain people special powers to harm others and cause mischief. And a witchcraft craze swept through Europe from the 1300s to the 1600s. Thousands were executed. Again, most of them were women. The Salem episode occurred just as the European craze was on the wane. One might well ask, why did this happen in Salem Village? It's difficult to state a definitive answer. Note that this episode, by the way, actually occurred in what is now called Danvers, Massachusetts, Salem town being what is today the city of Salem. In 1692, the community of Salem Village was experiencing hard times. Refugees from upstate New York, Nova Scotia, and Quebec had been left homeless in the ongoing King William's War, which stretched from 1688 to 1697. And they resettled in the area of Salem Village and put a strain on the community's resources. But more significant in colonial New England, when religion was the paramount force in people's lives, might be that Salem Village was struggling to hire and keep a minister, an issue that divided the community and pitted neighbor against neighbor. Eventually, they settled on Samuel Paris, a Harvard dropout who had lived in Barbados and whose business as a sugar merchant had failed. In January 1692, members of Paris's household in Salem Village, where he, of course, had moved after his appointment, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to experience fits and claimed that they had been bitten and pinched and otherwise tortured, and that they were in dire pain. They may indeed have fallen under the influence of Tituba, an enslaved person with origins in the Caribbean, who was a member of the Paris household and may have come from Barbados to Salem Village with the Paris family. She entertained the girls with fanciful tales and predictions about their futures. Eventually, witchcraft was determined to be the cause of the girls' continuing suffering, and 3 women were charged, including Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good. More and more individuals, many of them young girls, began to show signs of similar maladies, and dozens were brought into hearings organized by local magistrates. The governor ordered the establishment of a special court, and the dramatic trials began. Now, there were some strange aspects to this series of trials. One of them was that spectral evidence, that is, ghosts and dreams that only those who were the accusers could see, and no one else could, that type of evidence was allowed and deemed credible. Confessions, usually an admission of guilt, were encouraged in these proceedings. And those who confessed were actually spared because even though they admitted their guilt, their confession was seen as a sign of repentance. And those who claimed they were innocent and refused to confess were executed because they refused to repent. So there were some strange doings in this series of trials. Despite a cautionary letter from the respected minister, Cotton Mather, about relying on spectral evidence, 5 people were sentenced initially and hanged in July. The spectacle continued throughout the summer and on into the fall. 19 people were hanged, and one, Giles Corey, was pressed to death as he refused to cooperate. He felt that if he didn't answer to the charges, then he couldn't actually be put on trial. Several of those who were accused died in jail, and the lives of their families and friends were turned upside down. In the aftermath, some of those involved in carrying out the trials publicly admitted that they may have been mistaken. That was a little late in coming. In 1711, the colony of Massachusetts passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of those who had been accused and granted restitution to some, but not all of the families. It was not until 1957 that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts formally apologized for the injustices inflicted on the victims during the events of 1692. So that's a little bit of the story of what was going on at the time that people began to move into our area. So I'm going to stop for a moment and talk about a theory or a description given by one of the contemporary historians of the Salem witch trials, Emerson Baker, who is a professor at Salem State University, who teaches a course on the Salem witch trials and who has written a wonderful book, A Storm of Witchcraft, which has a significant number of pages devoted to Framingham, in which he calls the Salem End. So Emerson Baker calls what happened when several of the families who had been tainted by the witchcraft accusations moved away from Salem Village and the surrounding areas and settled in other towns. And he called this the Salem Diaspora. As you can see from the map that he created, the families stayed mostly in New England in towns like Bethel, Maine, Acton, Massachusetts, New Salem, aptly named, and eventually Oxford, Massachusetts. Baker writes, however, that most notable, and I'm quoting here from his book, most notable in the Salem Diaspora was the settlement of the Salem End neighborhood in the present-day Framingham, Massachusetts, by the accused witch Sarah Cloyce, which is how her name was spelled at that time, C-L-O-Y-C-E, and her extended kin, including the family of her sisters, the executed witches, Rebecca Nurse and Mary Ed.D. So let's now turn to the three town sisters whose names are mentioned by Emerson Baker as being the center of the group that came and settled in Framingham. For me, the saddest of the 3 victim stories may be that of the oldest, Rebecca Town Nurse, perhaps because of her age and the fact that she was a grandmother, and I have lived next door to the nurse or the Norse house on Salem End Road for 50 years. Her tragic end strikes a very personal chord with me. Let me tell you a little bit more about Rebecca. She was born in Great Yarmouth, England in 1621 and brought to Massachusetts Bay Colony by her family around 1640, settling first in Salem and then in Topsfield. Around 1644, by the way, you're going to hear me throwing around a lot of arounds as I'm giving you dates and years because record keeping was not very precise back in the 16 and 1700s. And everything was handwritten, and handwriting was hard to read. So that being said, around 1640, her family emigrated from England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. At this time, Rebecca was about 19 years old, and they settled first in Salem and then in Topsfield, Massachusetts. Around 1644, she married a man named Francis Norse, an artisan by trade who apparently made a pretty good living by carving household items, including trays that were very valued at the time. The couple had 8 children, and in fact, in all of the accounts that I have read, they're described as a very respectable family. Early in the witch hysteria, in March of 1692, Rebecca was named as a witch by members of the Putnam family, who had a history of disputes with the Town family, and she was arrested on charges of tormenting Anne Putnam Jr. and other young women in the Salem Village area, who began to break into convulsive fits during her testimony. Now, the reason why the Town family and the Putnam family were instrumental in Rebecca's accusations was that Rebecca was a Town. She was Mrs. Nurse, but originally she was a Town. And so this feuding went back perhaps a generation or so. Well, initially, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict for Rebecca. And as soon as the verdict was read, the girls who claimed she had been tormenting them broke into a new round of fits and cries and wailing and writhing in the courtroom. Rebecca, who was hard of hearing and may have made incriminating comments during the testimony because she couldn't hear and understand the questions in all the commotion going on in the courtroom. This was seen as a sign of her guilt, which she never admitted. And the jury deliberated for a second time. And this time they came back with a guilty verdict. A number of her family members and friends, at great risk to their own safety, wrote petitions in her favor, but to no avail. Massachusetts Governor Phips actually pardoned Nurse, but later reversed his decision under a lot of outside pressure. Rebecca was excommunicated from Salem Village Church and hanged on July 19th, 7 years old. Moving on to her younger sister, Mary Town Easty, I have to say that the second sister accused here was probably, if Rebecca was the most tragic, I would say that Mary might have been the most heroic. Like her sister Rebecca, Mary was born in England. She married a man named Isaac Easty, who was a farmer and a barrel maker, in 1655 in Topsfield, Massachusetts, and together they had 7 children. Like her sister, she was a respected member of the community at the time that she was accused of witchcraft. One of the accusers, Mercy Lewis, made particularly inflammatory and explicit statements, to which Mary replied with remarkable calm. She was released after 2 months in prison, but when Mercy Lewis again claimed that Mary was torturing her, she was aroused from her bed in the middle of the night and taken back to prison. Mary sent a petition to the court in her defense, not so much in her own defense, but actually in defense of all of those who were accused. Another historian whose work is extremely important in understanding and sifting through all of the many, many books and articles that have been written about the Salem witch trials, historian Bernard Rosenthal, who in his analysis of Mary Town Easty claimed that, and I'm quoting from his book here, Mary dramatized the fatal weakness of judicial dependence on confessions, which I explained to you earlier. Some born of unbearable stress, some given under torture, but most of them simply contrived to save someone, a person's own life. and he claims that it was Mary who stripped the emperor's clothing in these proceedings. Despite her heroic and well-reasoned efforts to spare others what she had endured, she knew at this point that she was probably not going to be spared, and she was hanged in September on the last day of the executions. Moving on to Sarah. Today, the most well-known, not always, but largely because of plays and movies, Sarah has become the most well-known of the Town sisters. She was the youngest of the three and the only one who was not born in England. She was born right here in New England and baptized in Salem, but moved with her family to Topsfield, where she married a man named Edmund Bridges, who was a blacksmith, and reportedly they had 6 children. Now, Edmund Bridges' background is a little bit sketchy. He sometimes practiced the law in addition to his blacksmith work, and at some point later in his life, he was disbarred and not allowed to practice the law anymore. Bridges died around 1681, and Sarah, who had been living in Topsfield at this time with Bridges, was ordered out of town in September of 1682. Why? Probably because she didn't have any money. Bridges had left the bulk of his estate, such as it was, to his oldest son, and Sarah was left with nothing. So she moved back to Salem Village. Not long after this, she married Peter Cloyce at that time, and had at least one more child, a daughter. At the time of her older sister Rebecca's trial, she attended services in Reverend Parris's church and stood up and left the building when he announced that the topic of his sermon on this particular Sunday would be the existence of the devil among members of his own church and community. Sarah knew he was referring to her sister Rebecca, and the door slammed behind her when she left the building. A sign of defiance? Maybe an intentional slamming of the door, but some of the eyewitnesses that day recorded that it was a windy day and perhaps the door had simply slammed in the wind. We'll never know which was true, but soon Sarah too was accused of witchcraft. She was jailed in Boston and later moved to a jail in Ipswich to await her trial. During her imprisonment, her husband Peter visited her frequently. In October, the court that had been trying the accused witches with all that spectral evidence that I've been talking about in those forced confessions, that court was dissolved by the governor, and a newly formed court was appointed to hear the remaining cases. Now, at this point, according to historian Emerson Baker, despite dramatic stories about Sarah escaping from jail and hiding out in the caves in the woods here, the grand jury of the newly appointed court never produced a true bill of indictment against Sarah Cloyce, and she was released after spending 9 months in prison. According to the Salem Witch Museum website, despite the premise of the popular 1985 film, 3 Sovereigns for Sarah, reparations in the form of 3 sovereigns, one representing each of the accused sisters, those reparations were never paid to the family, which was the premise of the movie. But otherwise, the movie has been described as historically quite accurate. Now, I mentioned Thomas Danforth briefly, that is Danforth's Land. So let's stop and take a few moments to consider him. He was a prominent official in colonial Massachusetts. He didn't live in Framingham, he lived in Cambridge. He was originally from Framingham, England, from which the name of our community is derived. He served at once treasurer of Harvard College, a member of what would be today our state senate, and was the Middlesex County Recorder of Deeds. He was initially given a land grant of 250 acres near the Sudbury River for his work on the so-called Puritan Blue Laws. You've probably all heard of those. And at some point, he added to his holdings, which became known variously as Danforth's Farms, Framingham Plantation, and eventually simply Framingham. The L was dropped, and a good thing too, because Framingham doesn't roll too easily off the tongue. Framingham is much easier to say. In the 1670s, a small number of settlers built homes on Danforth's land, but it was for the most part undeveloped by European Americans, that is. These lands were often used by the indigenous people for their summer encampments and for storing their corn during the winter, but they were considered pretty much wilderness by the Europeans. In 1679, Thomas Danforth was named deputy governor of Massachusetts, and this is where he gets involved in the Salem trials, because in this capacity, he presided over some of the trials of those accused of practicing witchcraft. And in the writings of another prominent figure in the Salem trials, Judge Samuel Sewall, Danforth was talking about how he was beginning to disapprove of how the trials were playing out. He might very well have worked behind the scenes to bring the trials to an end. Historian Emerson Baker, whom I quoted earlier, claims that Danforth must have had a direct hand in Sarah and Peter's migration. And he also notes that if someone were trying to escape from Salem Village in the immediate aftermath of the trials, Danforth's land in Framingham would have been, quote, one of the best places to go. I'm assuming it was one of the best places because it was far enough away from Salem Village so that these families could start over again, but not so far away that they couldn't travel back and forth and visit their friends and relatives. All right, now let's take a look at the first families who came here. The spelling of the names varied, by the way. One time, his town historian Stephen Herring notes in his tercentennial history of the town from 1700 to 2000, that after they moved from Salem, Sarah and Peter always spelled their name Clays. Now, whether this change was an attempt to shed their difficult past or simply a preference for Clays over Cloyce, we do not know. But changing the spelling of surnames was done fairly frequently in that period in time and didn't require all the bureaucratic legal steps that are necessary today. So maybe it was just their preference. The land where they built their first house was near the Cowsac Brook on what later became Salem End Road, originally a Native American winding path. It's still a pretty winding road. And this land was probably leased from Thomas Danforth and not gifted to the Clays family. Sarah and Peter were joined, as you can see, by a number of family members, children, stepchildren, grandchildren, nephews, and their families. 4 names are of paramount significance to the creation of the town: Bridges, Nurse, and Town, Towne, as well, of course, as Clays. John Town, by the way, was Sarah's nephew. He was one of Rebecca Town Nurse's, Rebecca's sons by her first marriage were among the group, and John Town, and his son Israel, who were Sarah's nephews, were also within the first group. They came a couple of years later. By 1699, there were 12 families in the area that came to be known as Salem Plain at that time and later Salem End. What I'm going to do for the next few slides is I'm going to talk about each of the 4 families and show you the properties that are associated with their names. So the first house, since we've been talking a lot about the Clays, and really they are the central family in the story, so we'll start with their house. Despite the long-held belief in this community that the house seen here was originally built either by or for Peter Clays, historical architects have determined that it was constructed later, perhaps in the 1760s or the 1770s, or even as late as the 1790s. This is according to a historical development report that was prepared about this property. A man named Colonel David Brewer, a relative by marriage, purchased the property in 1776 at the age of 24, and he probably was the one who built the current structure. Now, Peter Clays may have built his house somewhere else on the property, although there is some speculation that the current seller of the seller of this current house may indeed have been the seller of Peter's house. We don't know for sure. Now, Peter is a key figure in the story of the Salem End families and how they influenced the founding of Framingham. So let's take a look back a little bit at his life before he and Sarah moved into the area. Peter was born in Watertown, Mass. Around 1640 and was a captain in King Philip's War in the 1670s, a war, by the way, that touched what became Framingham in a very tragic way with the what happened to the Eames family, which is another story for another time. So Peter married a woman named Hannah Littlefield in Wells, Maine, and they had at least 4 children. After Hannah's death in 1680, Peter married the widowed Sarah Bridges of Salem Village, and they had 1 daughter together. He joined the Church of Christ at Salem Village in 1689 and signed the covenant that hired the Reverend Samuel Parris, something I'm sure he lived to regret considering what happened to his family in the aftermath of that decision. It should be noted here that Sarah also joined that church in 1690, 2 years before she was accused of witchcraft. Now, after his sisters-in-law, Rebecca Nurse and Mary Ed.D, were accused of witchcraft, Peter turned against Parris, not surprisingly, and was named by the latter as being one of the dissident brethren of the church. Parris complained that Peter was seldom at home during all of this tragedy that was being played out. And he claimed that he was being often with his wife in prison at Ipswich, who was accused of witchcraft. Apparently, Parris didn't think that this was a very good use of Peter's time. Now, we can only imagine how distraught this couple must have been living with the accusation of witchcraft and the knowledge later of the heartbreaking deaths of Sarah's sisters. Whatever the exact details of how Peter and Sarah came to live on Danforth's land in Framingham, we can surmise from official town records indicating Peter's involvement in organizing and serving in the new town that Peter was committed to leading a purposeful life. However, there is little concrete evidence about the comings and goings of their daily lives. Historian Josiah Temple, in his comprehensive history of Framingham, first published in 1887, described Peter Clays as taking, quote, a leading part in the organization of the town. He served as town treasurer, as town meeting moderator. He was a surveyor of the highways, a member of the grand jury. During this time, while Peter was involved with all of these important positions in what became the town soon after he came here, Sarah died. And accounts say that she died in 1703, surrounded by her family. We can only hope that is true, given her difficult past. After Sarah's death, Peter soon married a woman named Susanna Beers of his hometown of Watertown. In his will, Peter bequeathed Susanna 1 room in his house, so long as she remained a widow, as well as any provisions left in the house at the time of his death, including 200 bushels of Indian corn and other possessions. And he signed with his mark. So apparently Peter Clays couldn't write, but he could read. His son from his first marriage, Peter Clays Jr., followed in his father's footsteps in terms of being involved in town government and helped establish the first school. And it was he who took over ownership of the house upon the death of his father, the house in which his stepmother was given one room to live. Now, let's move up the road to the Norse house. This property on Salem End Road was developed by John Nurse, one of Rebecca's sons, and Sarah's nephew, around 1694. Now, don't be fooled by the date of the construction of the current house, which on the chimney notes is 1694, because the date is actually unknown, despite this date on the chimney. And I've been told by folks who know a lot about such things that his years on chimneys in New England in historic houses are usually unreliable. It may be the year that the property was developed, but not necessarily the year that a particular house was built. The style indicates that this house was probably built in the mid-1700s. According to the Framingham Cultural Resources Inventory, a major renovation took place in the mid-1800s and altered the original house considerably. And there was also a fire when the Perini family, the owners of the construction company, and also at that time, the owners of the Boston Braves. The Perini family owned it in the mid-1900s. Actually, they owned it when I moved to the area in 1971. And after the fire, they rebuilt the house and added several rooms to the back, kind of dormitory style. The Perinis had a large family. They had 11 kids. And so these bedrooms were added to accommodate the family. After the Perinis sold it, it kind of deteriorated a bit, and a couple of the owners really didn't try or were unable to keep the property up. Until more recently, when, according to the Cultural Resources Inventory, the past two owners, the two most recent owners, quote, conscientiously and beautifully restored the house. Since I live next door to that house and I look upon that beautiful property all the time, I can attest to that. It is a beautiful place. It should be noted that the house remained in the hands of members of the Nurse family until the late 19th century. The land was set aside, some land was set aside across the street by descendants of the original owners for one of their married daughters. So the Norses had property on the even side of the street, which you see in that house, and they also had property across the street where the odd numbers are. Now, they're not apparently as deeply involved in local government as the Clays family was, but the Norses nonetheless dutifully contributed taxes to purchase ammunition for the defense of the community. And Rebecca's son, Benjamin, served as the selectman during the early years of the town's existence, as well as a surveyor of highways of critical importance during this period when there were no roads and they all had to be laid out and built in one way or another. He was also a constable, which could be a difficult and thankless position, which I will talk about in a few minutes. Now, Benjamin's will, like that of Peter Clay's, is a neat piece of social history, and it provides a glimpse into everyday life and what was considered valuable in the 1700s. One point that we see in Benjamin's will that we saw in Peter's was that his widow could only count on having a roof over her head until she remarried, when someone else would be responsible for giving her shelter. So Benjamin bequeathed his wife, Elizabeth, his, quote, best bed and furniture, 2 cows, 1/2 of the household goods, firewood, and an able and gentle horse, and meat and swine in his possession at the time of his death. Footnote to history, one of the Nurses, descendant of Josiah Nurse, served in the Revolutionary War and lost his life at the Battle of Newport. The Nurses officially changed the spelling of their names to Norse in the 1700s. Now let's talk a little bit about the Bridges family in the same neighborhood. The house that you see here is the Caleb Bridges house on Gate Street, and it was built around 1700, probably at the time that Caleb Bridges married Sarah Brewer. And the Temple family, which was another prominent family in town, lived there for probably 3 generations after. This house was formerly used by the Framingham Country Club in the early 1900s as a clubhouse. And according to the Framingham Assessors database, it lists now as a health spa. 2 members of the original group, Caleb and Benjamin Bridges, Sarah's children and Peter's stepsons, were very much involved in town government, like the others, during the early years. Benjamin was a blacksmith and Caleb was a bricklayer by trade. Benjamin, the older brother, served as selectman and constable and was involved in hiring the first schoolmaster. Caleb, in addition to holding an official position as constable, was a field driver and fence builder and made repairs to the meeting house. And the stocks, yes, we had them here in Framingham too. Now, I didn't know what the job of a field driver was when I read this information, so I looked it up and I found out that a field driver had an important job. It was his responsibility to go out in the fields from time to time and to round up any stray animals that had gotten loose from their farms and either impound them or get them somehow back to their original owners if that ownership could be proven. Benjamin's grave, by the way, can be found in the old burying ground, Framingham's oldest cemetery located on Main Street. And his tombstone may be the earliest known grave of the Salem End refugees in the community. Moving on to the Town family, we have 2 existing houses associated with them. On the on the left-hand side of the picture, you see the John Town house on Maple Street that was built around 1700 and later purchased by Jonathan Maynard, another important family in the town's history, and in 1713, and was used as a tavern during his ownership. To the right, you see the Israel Townhouse, which is set back on the corner of Mayhew Street and Salem End Road. It actually borders on the Framingham State University parking lot, the Salem End parking lot. As you can see from the slide, like the Clays, the Norses, and the Bridges, John Town was deeply involved in local affairs. Historian Josiah Temple called him a leading man in both town and church activities. He was one of the original selectmen. He helped bring the first minister to town. He served on the grand jury and helped to build the meeting house. His son Israel built a house on the property that you can see in the picture, and that house still stands. In an article published in the Gatepost, which is the Framingham State University newspaper, students living in the house in 2019 were quoted as saying that they often heard mysterious thumps in the night, doors opening suddenly, and lights flickering at random. They claim to have felt an unsettling presence, and they say that former tenants told them that they saw ghostly apparitions in colonial garb flitting throughout the household. Well, if they say they saw them, then we're going to have to believe that they believed that they did. John Town, his son Israel, of whom I've been speaking, and his brothers Ephraim and Jonathan moved on to Oxford in 1713 and helped to found that town as well. I should mention here that among those who went to Oxford was Hannah Barton. She was one of the original Clays, and she married a man named Barton, and they settled in Oxford, and they were the ancestors of the famous Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross and who had another connection to Framingham, which is a story that I don't have time to tell here, but oops. moving on quickly to the first church. If you take a stroll in the town common in Framingham Center, among the many historic buildings, you will see two impressive churches, both with origins in the community's earliest years. A church supported by property taxes was organized in 1701. There was no such thing as separation of church and state at that time. So tax money was used to support the church. Members of the Salem End families were instrumental in the establishment of the first church in Framingham. Both of the churches seen here, the Plymouth Church, which is on the left, and the First Parish Church on the right, can trace their origins to that first congregation in 1701. The first meeting house, such as it was used for both town meetings and church services. And among the 18 residents who signed the first covenant were 4 members of the Salem End families, Peter Clays, Benjamin and Caleb Bridges, and Benjamin Nurse. John Town, as noted earlier, helped to hire the first minister, John Swift. I thought I should mention that this first minister, Mr. Swift, Reverend Swift, was the owner of 5 enslaved people at the time that he was hired as our minister. Eventually, there was a rift in the church with the rise of Unitarianism, which some of the members of the congregation favored. And so the congregation split into 2 entities, forming the Plymouth Church of Christ, which you see again on the left, and First Parish Unitarian on the right. So they both can legitimately trace their origins to the original congregation in 1701. So we have our friends involved in the first government, involved in organizing the first church. And of course, they helped to organize, logically, the first school. It would naturally follow that they would be involved in this. Now, at the time that the town was incorporated in 1701, there were approximately 100 school-age children living widely scattered over 30 square miles. It was pretty tough to create a school to handle 100 children living all over 30 square miles in this part and that part of town. And so the town originally lagged behind in trying to establish a school. The first mention of a public school in the town records is for the year 1706, when Joshua Hemingway was named as schoolmaster. The all-important question of his salary was negotiated by our friends, Benjamin Bridges and Peter Clays Jr. For the most part, education was handled privately in so-called dame schools run by women in their homes or provided to older children by the traveling schoolmasters. Apparently, the town did lag in the construction of an actual schoolhouse and did so only under pressure from the colonial government, which had passed a law saying that if X number of families live in a particular community, there has to be a school to provide public education. These children needed to learn to read so that they could understand the Bible and so forth. There is a marker that you can see here at the top right-hand portion of the slide. That's prominent in the old burying ground at the site of the first school that was built in 1714. It wasn't much of a school. It was unfurnished and it was underutilized. It was there to satisfy the letter of the law, but not too many children actually went there. During the winter season, 5 homes were designated as places where classes would be held. They were designated sort of neighborhood schools, if you will, including the home of Benjamin Bridges in Salem End. So let's quickly summarize, because we don't have too much time left. And I do want to leave a little time for questions. So the first officials of the town of Framingham from the Salem families included the names that I have been talking about over and over again: Bridges, Clays, Nurse, and Town. They were selectmen, they were moderators, they were constables, they were surveyors of the highways, and they were assessors. And some of them signed the first petition to be named a town with its own government. You can see on the early town seal that Danforth Farms is front and center there prominently on the seal. I did mention that I was going to tell you a little bit about what the constable's job was. All of these others are pretty self-explanatory. But the constable, in addition to keeping order, which we would assume would be his principal responsibility, he also notified residents about the town meeting. So he went around and told different property owners that the town meetings were going to be held. And he was responsible for collecting the taxes. Now, this must have been a pretty stressful job in the 1700s because the constable was responsible for collecting the full amount that each property owner was assessed. So if a person couldn't pay what they were assessed, then it was up to the constable to make up the difference from his own resources. As someone said to me earlier today, why would anyone want that job? But someone had to do it. And so some of our friends from Salem did. If you want to see some of the names that I've been talking about, you will find them on many of the stones in the old burying ground, and also some in Edgell Grove Cemetery as well. But those are of more recent vintage. Now, in October of 1982, Stephen Herring, the curator of the Framingham Historical Society, the Framingham Historical and Natural History Society, excuse me, and later the town historian, and also the author of a wonderful book on the history of Framingham, gave a presentation. I guess October is the month for giving presentations about the Salem families. So Mr. Herring wrote some very poetic words about these stones in the old burying ground, and I thought I would read them to you. In his lecture, he said, and his lecture notes, he wrote, many of the stones bear the names Nurse, Town, Bridges, and Clays. To Salem, they were witches, but to Framingham, they were, among others, our founding fathers and mothers, and we should not forget them. We're not forgetting them tonight, are we? The legacy of the Salem families, oops, oh, yikes. See if I can get back to this slide here. I just did a quick summary. And I also included another of Herring's quotes, which was that in addition to signing the first church covenant and participating in the first town meetings and being involved in the first school and building historic homes and fortifications, we had a fort on Bear Hill, which is the main hill for the Framingham State University. And we also had a fort here in the Salem End part of town where I live. I'm saying here because this is where I live, but I don't know exactly where it is located. Anyway, Herring claims that the Salem End families actually formed the core of the town that came to be. And I will read another of his quotes. Had it not been for the central core population, it is possible that no new town would have been formed here. Stone's End and Rice's End could have been part of Sudbury. The Eames land could have gone to Sherborne. In fact, there was quite a lengthy dispute over that. And the western settlements could have been annexed to Marlborough and eventually Holliston and Hopkinton. It's interesting to speculate. So if there had been no core of Salem End families, which he noted on this map that he looked at in 1699 and how different it was from 1690, if those families hadn't come and settled that area, perhaps there never would have been the city of Framingham. I'd like to end with something that I wrote. Again, let's try to get back to I have a little bit of trouble with my mouse here. This should not take long. I'd like to end with this excerpt from an essay that I wrote a few years ago when I first arrived, when I first started to think about Sarah and the Salem families and began to research their impact on the founding of our community. And this is a little bit of what I wrote. For many years, nearly every day as I drove along Salem End Road where I live, I passed what could only be described as an eyesore. The house you see on the left-hand side of the slide was large and rambling. Windows were boarded up, paint was peeling, the grounds overgrown with weeds and vines. The property, which included a collection of crumbling outbuildings, is situated very close to the road. Passers-by like me could not avoid being drawn to look at the desolate, haunted expanse that was the Clay's house at that time. I have wondered about Sarah from time to time. I feel almost as if she is my neighbor, her presence preserved in the once tumble-down house, decaying barn, and untended wild grounds so close to my home. How did she manage to survive the trauma of nearly losing her life in the same awful manner as her sisters and go on to build a new future on the very road where I have lived for half a century? What did she look like? Was her faith shaken by her ordeal? Did she learn to laugh again and enjoy the everyday pleasures of an ordinary life? Her full story remains largely untold, and we are left with a mixture of cold facts and untrustworthy legends. Many have attempted to tell Sarah's story in fiction and film and plays, but none has really solved the mystery of who Sarah Town Bridges Clays really was. Most, save the official court records, are merely speculative. More than 300 years after the fact, it is hard to know how accurate the accounts might be of who Sarah Clays was, however dedicated their creators might have been to finding the truth. What would Sarah think of the property now that it has been spared the wrecking ball, repaired, and beautifully restored? Would she approve of its rebirth, which is in keeping with her wrenching but ultimately uplifting story? Or might she have preferred that the broken down ruins be left undisturbed as a reminder of the tragic past that brought her here? We will never know. All right. So you probably received selected resources, a sheet for further research if you'd like to take some on yourself. And let me just say that if you really want to get to dig into the history, there's no better place to do it about the houses than the Framingham History Center, which has fascinating records and architectural designs and so forth of the houses about which I have spoken. And the Framingham Public Library's local history room has a great collection of resources for those who want to learn more. Okay, I'm done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anita. And we have time for a few questions. I recognize it's getting a little close to 8 o'clock, but we'd still love to take a few questions from you. So please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. And we do have some comments and questions in the chat that I'd like to read out to you. Andrea says, I recall once learning that many New England houses that look sort of like a set of nesting boxes, with the smallest box at the rear, were often built over time, with the smallest one being the original and each successive larger section being an improvement. I wonder if that might be true for some of these homes?
I think so. In fact, I did mention to you about the Norse house, which at the time that the Perinis owned it, which actually was much later than when it was originally built. But that section that was added on is a good example of that you have the original house here, and then you have this section that is tagged on behind it. And you also see that in some of the other properties. Now, the Clays house also had, as I mentioned in that little essay that I had written, it did have several sections to it and then some outbuildings as well. So yes, I would agree that she's right there about that being the case with some of these houses.
We've got another question from a different Andrea. She wanted to know, was Josiah Temple, Framingham historian, among the Temples who lived in the Bridges house on Gates Street?
Possibly. I'm not sure about that. That was one of the little details I was going to try to find out because I was curious about that myself. But I think he might have been, but I'm not sure.
Carol says, I saw the Clay's house in 2015 inside as well. Is it now being restored?
It has been restored, and it's been beautifully restored by people who really know how to restore old houses. In fact, it was on the Framingham History Center's house tour a couple of years ago when you could really go into houses and you could see not only how the improvements that were made and the restoration details, but also there were architectural plans that were provided at that time. And actually this year, the Framingham History Center, I believe, has that house on its virtual tour. So you can see the inside and see how well done it is. So yes, it's been restored. It doesn't look anything like that picture that was on my last slide.
Carol says she's so glad.
Yes, I'm too, but as I said, I don't know about Sarah. Okay.
So this is a question of mine. I know you talked a lot about Sarah as your neighbor. Was it really just the presence of her house that got you interested in this journey? What was it about Sarah of the three sisters that really, or the families, I should say?
Well, I think that, again, the proximity, because I've lived on Salem End Road now since 1971, and I knew something of the history. But the other point that I didn't make that makes this also personal, well, Sarah, I began to think about because of the house, and it was called the Clay's house, and then it was called the Sarah and Peter Clay's house. And then I started to learn a little bit more about Sarah and the film, The Three Sovereigns for Sarah, and so forth. So I became interested and kind of felt her presence because of that. But the other point is that I live next door to the Norse house, and I have an old stone wall. I believe that my property was part of that Norse land, and I have an old stone wall in my backyard that could very well be, one of the original stone wall that was built by the Norse family. So yeah, it's very personal to me in that way.
Charlene says the Clay's house was on the house tour in 2020.
Yes, right.
Kathleen wonders, what was the origin of the myth that the families lived in the caves?
I have no idea. I mean, it's just one of those, it makes such a good story. And these caves are, even though they're collapsed now, you saw from that first, the second slide, that photograph, it does look like a place where people, could go and take shelter, but to live there for a whole winter and so forth, probably not so much. But it would be interesting to trace that myth because it makes a much more interesting story than just that they stayed with family or friends in Salem Village until Danforth told them that they could lease some land and they came here. That's not nearly as interesting as them escaping and hiding out in those caves and in hollowed out tree trunks. That would really have been a test of how tough they were.
I heard, Carol says, I heard the Clay's house was a place where Salem women could escape to. Is that true?
That I don't know. Salem women?
That's what they say, yeah.
Well, it could have been, now not that house. As I said, that house was built later, but it could have been that that Peter Clay's first house, because of Sarah's and Rebecca's and Mary's history of being accused of witchcraft, it could very well have been a place that would have been a safe, haven. But again, the witchcraft hysteria had ended by the time the Clays came here. So it could have been a place where women in trouble might have gone to stay, but they wouldn't have been accused witches because that had all ended.
Do we have any firsthand accounts directly from any of the women who were accused during that time? I know there wasn't a lot of writing in that point anyway.
No, and they were, for the most part, they were illiterate. And I'm not sure if that the document that I referred to, the petition that Marytown Eastie made to the court, was probably dictated to someone else. That's one of the troubles with researching all of this, because we have no idea what these people looked like or what their thoughts were, because they weren't prominent enough to have their portraits painted. There were no photographs. They didn't keep diaries. if they couldn't write, there probably were no letters. Now there may have been, and I did actually try to contact a descendant of the Ed family, but have not heard back from her about whether or not there was sort of a chain of evidence, if you will, in terms of diaries or letters, maybe not from the first, Sarah Clay's, or the first, in this case, Marytown Ed, but maybe daughters and sons that would have been educated and would have written letters and kept diaries. If anybody knows of any that are around, I would love to see them.
Okay, well, we are running out of time, but Anita, do you want to kind of leave us with a thought or two that you hope that we take away from this presentation?
Well, there are two things. One is that we should remember that the Salem End families were the victims of persecution, and they were looking for a new start. They were emigres, and they became immigrants. And I think we should remember that, there are people today who are in the same situation and who have been persecuted and who are experiencing tough times, and they're looking for a fresh start. And they don't have perhaps a so-called wilderness the way the Salem families did to start over. But I think it's important to remember that these people do need help when we can give it. And also, one other thing, if you just look at this history that I have run through for you, look at all they gave. They were immigrants, they were refugees, they were persecuted people, and they helped build a town. So given a chance, people that have gone through very stressful times and are forced to move and relocate can do great things and make important contributions to our society and to the land that we live in. I think I'll end there.
Well, thank you so much for this timely and timeless information and scholarship, images and everything. It was just so wonderful and informative. We're getting lots of thank yous in the comments. I've popped the evaluation form there a few times. So anybody who's here tonight, please feel free to let us know what you thought. And Anita, I'm so glad you mentioned the Eames family, because I did want to mention for November, we are thrilled to be partnering with the History Center to have a recorded showing of the reconsideration of the Eames massacre by Stason. So
which is no longer called the massacre, it is the tragedy.
Exactly. Right? Yep, exactly. And that's what we kind of wanted to re-show. That Stason did a really wonderful presentation earlier this year, and the History Center was kind enough to provide the video to us. So if you register on the same form that you registered for tonight's event, on the date that we say, you'll receive the link and you'll be able to watch it again on your own time and sort of reconsider that perspective there. And then also, Anita mentioned that list of resources. We did include that in the email that you received. If you received the email with the graphic on it, it included the link for the list of resources if you were interested in finding out more about the family in general.
Okay.
All right. Thanks again so much, everyone. And we hope to see you soon.
Okay.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.